Can the 797 shut COMAC out of the West? On paper, that sounds ridiculous. The Boeing 797 does not exist. There is no prototype, no assembly line, no firm launch date. Most analysts treat it as a shelved idea from a company still recovering from crisis. And yet, in January 2020, with the 737 MAX crisis unfolding, Boeing's new CEO told reporters the NMA would restart from a clean sheet. That distinction matters, because at the same time, China's state-backed manufacturer COMAC was preparing its own move. The C919 entered service in 2023, backed by a protected home market and long-term ambitions to break into Europe and North America. The narrative shifted almost overnight. For decades, global aviation was a two-player contest. Now, a third name was entering the conversation. Most observers assumed the real fight would be Airbus versus COMAC. Airbus already dominates the middle of the market with the A321XLR. Boeing, meanwhile, has been focused on stabilizing production and rebuilding trust. So why are we even talking about a plane that has never flown? Because the battlefield is not just about who has an aircraft in service today. It is about who defines the most profitable slice of the market tomorrow. Between single-aisle jets and wide-bodies sits a profitable gap. Too long for a standard narrow-body, too thin for a 787. Boeing once owned it with a 757 and 767. When those ended, the gap never truly closed. The 797 concept was Boeing's answer to that gap. A twin-aisle aircraft sized for roughly 220 to 270 passengers. Enough range to cross oceans. Designed to offer more comfort and faster turnarounds than single-aisle competitors. A purpose-built bridge between categories. But here's the core problem. COMAC's C919 is designed to compete against the 737 and A320 family. It sits below that 220-seat range. It depends on Western certification to enter Europe and the United States. And it relies heavily on Western suppliers for key systems and engines. If Boeing ever launches a purpose-built aircraft above the C919's capacity range, one that locks in Western carriers at the high-value end of the middle market, does that narrow COMAC's runway before it even reaches the gate? That is the question. To answer it, we need to look at one overlooked constraint that sits beneath all the headlines. Not just aircraft performance, not just certification, but the structural control points that decide who gets access to Western skies in the first place. And that is where this story starts to change. Before we can talk about shutting anyone out of the West, we need to understand what was left open in the first place. For years, airlines operated a simple ladder. At the bottom, narrow-body jets like the 737 and A320 handled short to medium routes. At the top, wide-bodies like the 787 and A350 handled long-haul, high-demand corridors. In the middle, Boeing's 757 and 767 quietly did something special. When Boeing ended production of both programs, it did not look dramatic at first. Airlines extended the life of existing fleets. Maintenance programs grew. Refits became common. But structurally, a vacuum formed. By the mid-2010s, hundreds of 757s and 767s were approaching retirement age. Airlines needed something with more seats than a narrow body, but lower trip cost than a wide body. Something efficient enough to serve long, thin routes without gambling on half-empty cabins. That is where the new midsize airplane concept, later labeled the 797, came in. The early outlines were precise. A twin-aisle aircraft, roughly 220 to 270 passengers, around 4,500 to 5,000 nautical miles of range. Large enough to outperform stretched single-aisle jets in capacity and comfort. Small enough to avoid the full operating burden of larger wide-bodies. Crucially, this was not meant to be a derivative. Boeing signaled a clean sheet design. Composite structures drawn from 787 experience. Systems influenced by the 777 and 787. Engines in the 50,000-pound thrust class. Development costs projected in the tens of billions. This was not a quick patch. It was a structural correction. But while Boeing studied and debated, Airbus moved. Instead of building a new aircraft category, Airbus stretched the A321. New engines, additional fuel capacity, reinforced structure. The result was the A321LR, then the A321XLR. With roughly 4,700 nautical miles of range, the XLR could perform many of the missions once owned by the 757. Airlines responded quickly. Major US and European carriers placed large orders. The lower half of the middle market tilted toward Airbus. And this is where the reversal begins. Most observers now assume Airbus owns this territory, that Boeing missed its window, that the 797 is a relic of internal indecision. But Airbus filled the lower edge of the gap, the 180 to roughly 220 seat band. The original 797 concept sat above that. A twin-aisle layout changes boarding speed, changes passenger perception on long sectors, changes cargo flexibility. At 225 to 270 seats, it does not directly replace the A321XLR. It defines a slightly higher ceiling. So the real question is not whether Airbus reacted faster. It did. The question is whether Boeing's delayed response still targets a slice of the market that neither Airbus nor COMAC fully occupy. Because if that upper middle segment becomes the profit core for Western carriers, then the 797 is not chasing Airbus. It is shaping the battlefield that COMAC has not yet entered. And that leads to the next tension point. Even if COMAC reaches Western certification, what exactly is it competing for? That framing hides a deeper constraint. The C919 entered service in China in 2023. It was a milestone. Years of development, heavy state backing, a clear message that China intends to compete head-to-head with a Western duopoly. On paper, the C919 competes directly with the 737 and the A320 family. Typical seating in the 160 to 190 range. Single aisle, designed for high-frequency domestic and regional routes. The long-term ambition is clear. Build scale at home, then expand outward. Southeast Asia first, eventually Europe and North America. But here is the structural tension. The C919 is not an isolated national product. It relies heavily on Western suppliers for critical systems. Engines from the LEAP program, produced by a joint venture between American and French firms. Avionics and flight systems sourced from established Western aerospace companies. That dependence is not a small detail. It is a leverage point. Certification in Europe requires approval from EASA. In the United States, from the FAA. Without those approvals, a Western airline cannot operate the aircraft in its core markets. Even with them, airlines evaluate resale value, maintenance ecosystems, pilot training pipelines, and long-term political risk. So when people ask whether the 797 can shut COMAC out of the West, they usually imagine a direct aircraft duel. Twin aisle versus single aisle. Seat count versus seat count. Range versus range. And that is where the reversal sharpens. If Western carriers are already hesitant due to certification timelines and supplier exposure, their fleet decisions become conservative. They will prioritize aircraft with established global support networks, known residual values, deep maintenance infrastructure. In that environment, even before the 797 launches, Boeing and Airbus define the safe options. Now layer this on top of the market segmentation we just discussed. The C919 targets the lower half of the narrowbody spectrum. The A321XLR stretches upward into long-range missions. The proposed 797 sits above both, targeting 220 to 270 seats with twin-aisle comfort. COMAC is not positioned in that upper middle band at all. So even in a scenario where the C919 gains European certification later in the decade, it would still compete primarily in the single-aisle category, the same arena where Airbus already dominates and Boeing is entrenched. This is the first major shift in understanding. The 797 does not need to defeat the C919 directly. It only needs to solidify the most profitable slice of transatlantic and medium-haul long-range routes for Boeing and its Western airline partners. If that happens, COMAC's Western opportunity narrows to a smaller segment. High-frequency short to medium-haul routes, lower margins, fierce competition, and here is the tension building under the surface. If Boeing activates the 797 at the moment next-generation engines are ready, and Western carriers are planning 757 and early 767 replacements, the decision window for airlines could close before COMAC fully enters the conversation. Which raises the structural question we have been circling. Was the 797 really delayed into irrelevance? Or was it paused at a point where its eventual launch could shape the map at exactly the moment China tries to expand? By 2019, the 797 looked like a missed opportunity. The 737 MAX crisis stalled momentum. Airbus moved first. The program appeared frozen. But that assumption ignores a quiet institutional move that reframes the entire timeline. In early 2020, Boeing did not formally cancel the new midsize airplane. Instead, the new CEO announced the company would restart the evaluation from a clean sheet. That language matters. Restart implies the business case was not abandoned. It was being reworked. Then came another signal. In a later labor agreement with its machinists union in Washington state, Boeing committed that its next new airplane would be built there. It did not name the model, but it made a public, contractual commitment tied to a future clean sheet program. That is not marketing language. That is an institutional anchor. Now step back. The NMA depended on next-generation propulsion to justify a clean sheet investment. The delay was not just crisis-driven. It was tied to engine readiness and long-term timing. If that engine technology reaches readiness in the early 2030s, the window for a new aircraft reopens at the same moment airlines begin planning the large-scale retirement of aging 757s, early 787s, and mid-capacity fleets. Now look at that from COMAC's perspective. Its C919 is focused on the single-aisle category. It is still working through certification pathways outside China. It is building production scale. Its long-term competitiveness depends on expanding beyond its protected home market. If, in the early 2030s, Western carriers are choosing between Airbus narrow-body derivatives and a new twin-aisle Boeing built for 220 to 270 passengers, the strategic center of gravity shifts upward. COMAC does not yet have a product in that segment. This is the reversal. The absence of the 797 today creates the illusion that Boeing ceded the middle market. But if the program returns aligned with next-generation engines and institutional commitment, it does not re-enter as a follower. It enters as a category setter. And once a category is defined by two Western incumbents at both the lower and upper edges, the path for a new entrant narrows dramatically. Which brings us to the final comparison. If you are a Western airline planning fleet renewal in the early 2030s, what are you actually choosing between? The real decision makers are airline fleet planners. Imagine the early 2030s. A major European or US carrier is retiring its remaining 757s and ALI 767 variants. It needs aircraft that can carry around 230 to 260 passengers on transatlantic routes, long enough to cross oceans, efficient enough to operate outside peak demand seasons. What are the options? Option 1, Airbus. A321XLR. Strong range, proven support network, but still a single-aisle aircraft. 4 8 or 9-hour sectors, passenger comfort, and boarding efficiency become operational considerations. Capacity typically sits below the upper 200 range in realistic two-class layouts. Option 2, COMAC C919. Assuming certification hurdles are cleared, it competes in the 160 to 190 seat bracket. It is not sized for 240-passenger transatlantic missions. Option 3, a new Boeing twin-aisle in the 220 to 270 seat category. This is where the 797 concept was positioned from the beginning. Not as a stretched narrow-body, not as a downsized wide-body, but as a bridge between them. Twin-aisle for faster boarding, wider cabin perception, range around 4,500 to 5,000 nautical miles. Here is the key shift. If Boeing launches such an aircraft, Western airlines evaluating long-term fleet strategy will naturally compare Airbus and Boeing first in that high-capacity band. The C919 does not enter that comparison. It sits one rung lower on the ladder, and that constraint matters in a market where the most profitable long, thin routes often require slightly more capacity than a typical narrow-body provides. In other words, the 797 does not have to defeat the C919. It only needs to define a profitable segment that the C919 does not reach. Now layer in certification timelines and political trust. Even if the C919 gains European approval later in the decade, Western airlines will weigh residual value, global maintenance ecosystems, financing terms, and geopolitical exposure. These are not emotional decisions. They are balance sheet decisions. If at that moment Boeing offers a clean sheet twin-aisle designed precisely for the middle of the market, it anchors Western fleet planning around Airbus and Boeing once again. COMAC is then forced to compete primarily in the lower-capacity single-aisle space, the most crowded, margin-sensitive segment of commercial aviation. This is where the title becomes less dramatic and more structural. The 797 does not need to slam the door shut. It only needs to narrow the doorway enough that COMAC never gains scale in the West. And that brings us to the final question. Does the 797 actually have the power to do that? Or is this entire argument built on a program that may never leave the drawing board? That is where the conflict peaks. So can the 797 shut COMAC out of the West? Right now, no. The aircraft is not launched. Airbus already holds hundreds of A321XLR orders. The C919 is flying in China but still working toward broader international certification. But here's the sharper conclusion. COMAC's biggest obstacle in the West is not the 797. It is certification timelines, supplier dependence, and institutional trust. Those barriers exist whether Boeing launches a new jet or not. The 797 becomes decisive only if it enters service at the moment Western carriers replace aging mid-capacity fleets. If that happens, Boeing locks in the 220 to 270 seat segment with a purpose-built twin-aisle. Airbus holds the stretched narrow-body tier below it, and COMAC is left competing in the most crowded part of the market. So the 797 does not need to crush COMAC. It only needs to shape the ceiling of the middle market. If Boeing activates it at the right time, the West may not be closed to COMAC by force. It may simply be filled before COMAC arrives.